So I wanted to carry on from talking about dukkha to talk a bit about craving, and by extension, aversion. I probably talked a bit more about aversion this morning in relation to the practice. But yeah, I'll frame it more in terms of craving this afternoon. So recently I was listening to a meditation teacher called Andrea Feller, who I'm very keen on. She's a student of Sayadaw U Tejaniya as well. And she said something like, she said, greed, hatred, and delusion, but particularly greed, they all carry the belief, they have the view embedded in them that the only way to be happy is to be connected to or separated, connected to the thing that you want or separated from the thing that you don't want. And if you don't act on that impulse that propels you towards something or away from something, then you'll be unhappy. So quite a deeply embedded view that I think we're not conscious of, but I think sometimes it can explain why we act in ways that are not sometimes in our best interests. There's this view operating that if I don't act, if I don't follow through on this craving, I'll be unhappy, and that's something to avoid. Dukkha is something to avoid. So Andrea Feller goes on to say, she says, these qualities, greed, hatred, and delusion, are not going to tell you there is another way. There's another way other than just acting on them. And we have to look in a different place that's not so much under their influence. That's more a place of wisdom and skillful qualities like mindfulness and love. So the Buddha says the same thing in the Sutra of the Two Darts, I think it is, where he says we really believe that we only have one way out of unhappiness. He's putting it the other way around, that if we're unhappy, then the best thing that we can do, pretty much the only thing we know how to do, is try and bring something pleasant into our experience. Staring at myself again. Good. So I really like this the implicit compassion in this view of the Buddha. He's not saying we're all daft because we're just going after pleasant things when it's obvious that they don't really quite work. It's like, this is the only way. This is the only thing we know what to do. So it's not surprising then that we do it. Yes, I really like the way that the Buddha frames it in that way. It's compassionate. So he then goes on to say, at some point he says, I let go of the craving for sense pleasure. So the focus isn't on the sense pleasure itself, it's not on the object, but he lets go of the craving or the clinging for the object. So the exploration of wanting or craving is more important, certainly in the short term, I think, than if you like, what we manage to stop ourselves doing. It's less important that we manage to stop acting out of craving, as long as there isn't an unethical component here. And for me, it's more less about the result, but more about the process of investigating craving and being curious and open to what happens here. Got a little story that I'm just trying to think if I can tell it briefly, but it's what I call my beer story. And so I was cycling home from work. Work was the Cambridge Buddhist Centre at this point, and I just cycling home, and I think it'd been a bit of a tough day, and I just thought to myself, I'm going to have a takeaway. I'm not going to cook. I'm going to have a takeaway. And then my next thought was, oh, and I'll have a beer with it. Oh yes, and there was this sort of a rising of pleasure at this thought, this idea, and a very clear sense of the craving, the wanting that went with that, this sort of impulse to have. And I got really interested in that. In that. Oh, that's interesting. There, on the one hand, there's this clearly knowing the craving, the desire that's arising, and on the other hand, there's in that clear knowing of it there's a real sense of it's very satisfying to see the mind in its subtlety like that, see what it's up to. And I sort of carried on cycling, and I didn't know whether I would act on this craving or not. I didn't know. My mind was sort of going between, if you like, being a bit involved in the desire for a beer, and this just simply aware of the craving and the interest, and curiosity about that. And I didn't know actually until I found myself stopping at the off license on the way home what I was going to do. And sometimes I've told this story and people have said, oh, but you had a beer, you know, you had it, you did it, you know, as if the only right end result would be that I didn't. But actually, it's important to watch the process and not to, for me, it was really important not to try and make something happen, but to let the factors of mind sort of, in a way, let awareness continue to be receptive and see how much sort of power there was to the awareness and the wisdom. And I knew that that would have its effect. I knew even if the outcome at that time was not that I decided not to have a beer. But actually several years later, just through another story, which I won't tell because it will take time, I did end up just deciding, actually I'd been on a very long retreat, and I had the very clear feeling when an opportunity arose going out with someone for a meal, was I going to have a beer, which, you know, every now and again I did, not very often. And I just thought, why would I, having put all this time and money and energy into awareness, into wanting to be aware, why would I do something that by its very nature is about unawareness? And it was just really clear to me in the moment, without any sense of trying to stop myself. It was just a clear sort of integrated decision that awareness and wisdom were sort of on board with, as, oh no, I think we're done with that. I think we're pretty much done with that. And that's been the case. But I suppose I very much see that early moment, that early experience of knowing that how satisfying it was to watch the mind. And even, well, whatever the outcome was, I sort of knew that I could see that the more fulfilling and the more attractive option was being able to recognize what was happening rather than being involved in it. So I think it is quite an important. It's quite important that we don't try and control what happens, unless, as I say, it's a clear ethical breach that we need to restrain. We need to practice restraint. But in the privacy of our own minds, there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of seeing what happens, and being willing to observe that without our own agenda, stepping in and curtailing that process. So that's my BS story. So actually, I realize that so many of my examples are about food or drink. It's slightly embarrassing. But they do help make the point. So I was passing a local shop the other day, and a couple of weeks beforehand, I'd been a bit ill. I had a couple of COVID tests, and they were both negative. But I thought the one place where I might have picked up COVID was through going to this shop where I go to. The main thing I go for is chocolate every now and again. It's not really essential. So I don't really have any. There was something saying that this is not a good thing to do. This is not essential by any means. But what I could feel, and it's back to what this quote from Andrea Feller was saying at the beginning, that if I don't act on what I want, it'll bring dukkha. That's the view. It'll bring suffering in its way if I don't act on it. And I could feel that this was in my mind. I could feel the desire to go into the shop and buy some chocolate, and I could feel this little voice that said something like, "You will be disappointed. You'll feel a bit like your afternoon isn't quite as nice as it would have otherwise been." Sort of warning me that if I'm to avoid dukkha, then I should go and get this bar of Cadbury's dairy milk or whatever. And that voice was quietly motivating, quietly and sort of insidiously motivating, warning me of dukkha and telling me the way out of dukkha is to act on this this craving, which didn't actually feel particularly strong. So I think often our cravings don't necessarily. I think sometimes for myself I can think, oh well, it's all right because I don't feel really strongly about it. But I've missed that. I've missed the view. I've missed this sort of little nudging voice that's saying, "Oh, go on, but you need to, otherwise, yeah, things won't be quite right." So Andrea Feller, she talks about this needy voice. Well, she talks about craving as this sort of neediness in us. That, oh, please, I want it, and it's like just sort of tugging on your sleeve a bit. Oh, go on, whining, and just going on until you give in. And there's a suffering in that sort of in the sort of lack of completeness in us. So something else that struck me, I think it was a couple of days after the chocolate one, which I didn't actually follow that through because I became clear about that little voice, and I was really curious about this little voice, which was just what Andrea Feller had said. There's this belief, this view that the only way to be happy is to follow through on my desires. So that was enough to, I didn't go into the shop. Just, Sampajanya clearly knowing says, oh, it's not necessary. What do you need to do? No, not necessary. But something else that struck me there a couple of days later, and this was to do with actually being in the shop. I think I had a valid reason to be in the shop this time. Who would think you could learn so much from the local McCalls just up the street? I probably had to post something. That's probably my proper reason for being. But there it was. There was Haagen-Dazs salted caramel ice cream on sale. And this is a particular sort of combination of factors. Not only is it my favorite ice cream, but often it's £5.69 or something. So I find it easier to say no to. But when it's £2.50 or £3, it's that much harder to turn it down. It's like the conditions come together where desire arises or craving arises. And I stood in front of the cabinet, I sort of saw it, and I stood in front of this freezer cabinet, feeling that impulse to act. And it's like a kind of agitation, feeling that. And as I stood there, if you like, I think there was a degree of right view quite strongly in the mind, because the seductive nature of that belief in the view that, oh, I need to act on this in order to be okay, was just seen in a much more neutral way. It was much less persuasive, and it was like, oh, really? No, I don't think so. And I walked on, but I did stood and had my little process in front of the freezer. So I think one of the things that craving does is it down onto the object. It sort of locks on. It's like a fighter pilot, and it sort of locks onto what it wants, and then it's quite hard to see anything else. But what happened in that moment where right view was there, and it became more, whether I had ice cream or not, it became a much more sort of neutral thing. Wisdom doesn't narrow down. It stays quite broad, and it sees the bigger picture. And in that moment, the bigger picture were things like, and this wasn't thinking about it, but it's just like, well, wisdom takes more factors into account. So it was like, okay, there's your teeth, there's your weight, there's your gallstones, and there's your ethics. There's the most of the time I'm vegan, most of the time I am, and Haagen-Dazs is one of the few times where that and pizza, actually. Though vegan, I make a very good vegan pizza now. So. But it's really interesting, all those things just known really quickly and naturally think about them. And then the choice was made. It was like, well, it's obvious in then that it's obvious which way it's going to go. But that sense of inevitability of acting, I think it's really, really helpful to be able to experience that in some way, and actually see for ourselves in the moment if there's enough continuity of awareness, and if there's some degree of right view, without trying to stop ourselves or direct an agenda. But what happens if we can be really open in that moment? I think one of the things that creates that sort of neediness or agitation to act on craving, it is the weight of our samskaras, the weight of habits that have been acted upon many times in the past, not necessarily for the same thing, but just, if you like, the craving muscle is well developed, and that view, each time we act on it, that view is further strengthened, that I can't be separated from something that craving wants. I feel like I've got to do what craving wants. Actually, I remember being in a group situation with Utejaniya and in Burma, and somebody had he's a very intelligent guy. He comes across, and somebody had said this to him, and he just laughed and he said, "Me, intelligent?" He said, "Until I was 30, I did whatever craving, aversion, and delusion wanted." You know, that was his definition of being very intelligent, just going along with, in a way, being pulled along by these habits, or with them driving us. Yeah, so we've acted on our craving many, 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 many times before. So I think that for me, that's another reason not to try and use my personal will or personal effort to try and halt those habits. I've done it, and then sooner or later I don't do it anymore. But I do find that habits can change if I, if you like, I grow the positive factors of mind, the factors of mindfulness, the factors of wisdom, that can really see a bit more clearly and make that choice without creating some sort of conflict in the mind between what I want and what I'm saying I can't have. So wisdom sees the consequences of following craving. So when there's some degree of right view about craving, it's we see and we experience craving for what it is. And we see that craving is not the only way. If you like, we're in touch with what the Buddha said, that compassionate response. Yeah, wisdom sees that craving is at best a temporary fix. It works partly because there is some pleasure, there is enjoyment, there can be enjoyment. I think it can be a very interesting exploration to work out whether that enjoyment of having something that we want, whether it's because of the thing itself, or whether the enjoyment is because in that moment, craving has sort of released its grasp. Once it's got what it wants, it lets go. And actually, maybe it's that's freeing and pleasurable. There's a little list which I'm not going to go into now, but I think it's quite interesting, and it's the gratification, danger, and escape. I think it's probably addressed to each of the poisons. But yeah, the Buddha was saying, yes, there is some gratification for acting on craving, but there's also a danger, the danger of further conditioning that quality in the mind. And then there's the moment of escape, the moment where, if you like, we're released from desire. And it's interesting, if given what I've just said, we can be released from craving by acting on craving. We can be released for a moment, or we can be released by having the right view on craving, and feeling the interest and the satisfaction of watching the mind, and that being more valuable than having what we want in that moment. I've got a little phrase. How long does wanting last in the mind if we don't feed it? And my experience is that it's momentary. There may be a few moments strung together, but if we're able to just feel it really sort of cleanly, and know it for what it is, then we don't give it any fuel. I was talking about this morning. something else arises. So I've mostly been talking about sense desire here, craving for sense pleasures. But I have got interested recently in the two other levels of craving, bhava tanha and vibhava tanha. So craving, desire for existence, or desire for non-existence. And I just maybe want to say a couple of things about each of these. I think there may be just a more subtle habits of mind, a subtle sort of mental, psychophysical levels. So I think that the bhava tanha, this bhava is becoming. It's like bhavana practice. So it's like that leaning forward into the next moment. The mind that can't quite be present, can't quite just be with things are in this moment. There's always the next moment. And the subtle dukkha of leaning in, because we're not quite settled, we're not quite sort of balanced in ourselves. And there's often that desire for something better in the next moment, or something more. How craving manifests. Sometimes when there's craving in the mind, it was a little bit like the reading this morning when the tiger and the lamb, and Bante's saying sometimes we're just in that sort of mind state where whatever we see, we've got our aversive glasses on, so that's the lens through which we're seeing. So whatever we see, we'll be irritated by or crossed by. And it's the same with bhava tanha. I think there's that sometimes the mind has just got its wanting glasses on, and so it's just looking for something to desire. I can notice that myself sometimes. Again, this little McCall shop up the road, I might just go for a box of matches or something, but I can, if there's some degree of particularly not quite recognized craving in the mind, it's like, oh, what could I have? What could I have? It's bonkers. But it's just an opportunity, if you like, to just see craving in its natural state without a particular object. It's just looking for an object. Yeah, and that story I mentioned yesterday with Queen Isolde and Tristan, the ill-fated lovers, and never being quite happy, always having a subtle sense of longing. Okay, so then vibhava tanha, I seem to have a bit more to say about this, so I'll pick and choose. I got interested particularly, I heard a talk recently, and actually maybe I won't go there, sorry. How I've thought about this, I've think about some of the songs that I used to like as a teenager. Some of the songs, I didn't necessarily like them, but they really spoke to me emotionally. And I think looking back on them, some of them now, I think, oh, that was this desire to not exist. So you may know a couple of them. So one of them was by Supertramp. And the words are something like, hide in your shell, for the world is out to bleed you for a ride, I think is so it's something like that. So it's this sense of hiding. My teenage state had a lot of pain at times, and there was a sense of just not wanting to exist, not wanting to inhabit. And then another one was Simon and Garfunkel. I am a rock, I am an island, and a rock feels no pain, and an island never cries. So it's a sense again of can't bear to feel, can't bear to be with myself. So I think there are different ways, obviously, that vibhava, tanha, this desire to not exist, manifests. I think we can manifest by zoning out, if you like, a sort of freeze in experience, not showing up emotionally, just not quite able to be there, be present. And I think it just can be helpful to see it just in terms of being able to get a sense of what this quality is. What is this? These other two manifestations of craving that the Buddha talked about. Yeah, they can, to me, I think they've often sounded a little bit abstract. I've not quite been able to relate to them in my experience. But one memory I did have, it was, and it's something I don't talk about very much, but seems to be talking more about my skydiving exploits. But I always used to think I didn't have a very strong desire to live. I didn't think I had a very strong hold on life. I think it was probably just because I was quite cut off. So I had a couple of years traveling where I did quite a lot of sort of risk taking. And I think I said the other day I was quite reckless with my life. But at one point in my early skydiving career, I couldn't find my ripcord, and I very, very nearly died. And I got very close to the ground, still not being able to find my ripcord, but still trying to pull something that actually had nothing to do with the ripcord. And it was only when I saw the horizon in a very different place to where it usually was that I realized quite how low to the ground I was. And I had these thoughts go through my mind. I thought dead, death, dying, something like that. Ripcord was the next one, and I went for my reserve ripcord. So actually I was surprised by the strength of that. Having had that view that I didn't have a lot of hold on life. Actually, when it came down to it, as soon as I sort of got out of the brain lock, not realizing the danger that I was in, as soon as I did, it was a very, very strong, a visceral sense of wanting to live, wanting to continue to exist. And something else I can relate to, which a friend was talking to me about recently, and he was talking about a time when there was a possibility that he had cancer in his 30s, and he realized there's a bit of him that felt relieved at that thought. It was something of the burdensomeness of life could be put down. And then it looked like he didn't have cancer. And again, he said he felt the whole weight of that burden sort of have to be picked up like a really heavy rucksack getting put back on. And then it turned out that he did have cancer. And again, so he had a chance to just really explore. And then he had cancer, he had an operation, and he was actually fine. But we carry this dukkha, and I think largely unseen, the dukkha of just keeping going with life. And I think I relate to it a bit more as I get older. There are diminishing returns on all sorts of things as I get older. The same amount of effort, but less reward in terms of keeping fit or trying to keep weight off, or the mind slows down, the memory's a bit rubbish. So obviously part of practice is accepting all these changes. but I get a bit more of a sense of what the Buddha was talking about. Actually, this the dukkha, just through living our lives, just through keeping going. So I've got curious about bhava tanha, and particularly vibhava tanha, because I think once curiosity is there and awareness is there, then, like I was saying this morning, these things come out from behind the lens. You start to see more and see them more clear. Oh, this is part of a view, or part of some sort of self-belief, or sort of self-construing that's going on. That can be seen, and once it's seen, it's not believed in the same way. It's not held to. Yeah, I think I've got something else over here. Yes, okay, this is important. So what do we do with all this? Well, actually, the more I think that we can accept and be with our primary dukkha, if you like, the dukkha that we notice, the discomfort of not getting what we want, or even the limitations of the pleasure of getting what we want. The more that we can sort of recognize all this happening, then we start to free ourselves from it. And we lessen those strategies. We take the energy out of those strategies of avoidance of dukkha, the strategies of craving and aversion. And Alio has this lovely phrase where he talks about we decondition the mind of its biases. And I think of that as a bit like we've got these grooves. These have grooves formed through our habits, and over time, we just don't go quite so far down the track, because awareness sort of sees, and the moments of wisdom perhaps send us down a different track, but we don't go so far. So gradually over time, I like to think of these grooves in the mind as sort of grassing over a bit. Even a few wildflowers in them. There's the landscape changes when we, and this is without necessarily a lot of sort of actively trying to do things differently. It has its place. What we're talking about here is, in a way, just allowing the strength of positive qualities in the mind. Really allowing them to do the work, and we get out of the way, just put in the conditions to cultivate them. Okay, so that really all is all I have to say. And I was away yesterday. I didn't leave time for questions because I wanted us to have a period of reflection. But I would like to, if there are any questions or comments now, I would like to just give a little bit of space to that. Absolutely fine if there isn't. But yeah, if there is.
I wondered about, you said, normally we don't have to do anything, but these positive, you just allow these positive qualities to have an effect on your mind. I wondered, but you said in some cases you do need to do something. I wondered kind of, if you had examples of that, when you think you do really need to do something.
Yeah, I suppose I think sometimes, like I say, with ethical choices, you've got to clear. You can only let something go on in to a certain degree, or maybe you've got a deadline actually, and you have to make a choice. You have to act. You can't. In a way, you sort of, there's just those occasions when you have to do that. But I think other times can be when there isn't awareness, perhaps isn't very strong in the mind, or mindfulness isn't very strong, and wisdom isn't very strong in the mind. Sometimes I quote my friend Mioshin Kelly, who says sometimes mindfulness is like a mouse and the mind state is like a mountain, and there's just no contest really. So I suppose part of awareness is evaluating the situation, thinking, okay, so there's this huge aversion in the mind or distress in the mind, and being aware of it is not effective. It's not really doing anything. In fact, the mindfulness is just getting overwhelmed by the mind state. So you just recognize part of it's still awareness, actually. You recognize that's what's happening, and what would be helpful here? Samprajanya again. What would be helpful? What's necessary here? So one of the things we can do in a situation like that is just direct the attention to something much more neutral. And that's a more active thing to do. We just direct it to the breath or something. We go for a walk, and we allow the mind to calm down. We allow the mindfulness to become more resourced. Maybe we do a resourcing practice, and we're not doing it to avoid the mind state, but just a sort of recognition that in that moment there's not, the conditions are not right. There's not enough mindfulness there. So in the long run, it supports what we do, supports the growth of awareness. But there are different sort of strategies. Having recognized what's going to be helpful in the long run. I actually think more and more. I think mindfulness is playing a long game, really. Mindfulness and wisdom. That's definitely what it felt like with me and the beer. It felt like I could, you just have to allow conditions over time, and sometimes you have to change your strategy. But anyway, so those sorts of occasions. So some externally driven and some more internally driven. And also just because there are lots of different ways of practicing, I suppose I'm just very, very clear that this isn't the only way of practicing. And if we go back to that garden image, then we can be in the garden, but sometimes we are actively pulling up weeds, and sometimes we are actively planting flowers. And I think we can also do both of those, the flowers and the weeds, within the context of just being in the garden. So we've got lots of ways of working. Anyone else? Moksha Darshini, Oh, you're muted.
I walked to the supermarket this afternoon with the walk-in meditation, which I found very helpful. And what I noticed was sort of going on was, it's like there's a habitual habit of going into, oh, that's pleasant, that's not pleasant, with, what was coming in. But as I was doing the walk, I didn't want to do that anymore. It just felt really sort of unnecessary, and there was a sort of sense of just, I think you're sort of saying in the meditation, it's just seeing, it's just allowing things to come into the visual field, if you like. And that felt sort of, that felt like a release of, I don't have to be doing all this, like, don't like, yellow, blue, what do I prefer, like on whatever level it was. And yeah, it was just felt very different, the walk. It was fascinating. And I just had this experience of noticing red, just noticing, oh, there's red. And then it was like red just sort of went pop, like sort of popped out everywhere in a kind of, let's join in with the red awareness. And yeah, so I'd just
Great.
like to thank you for that walk, because it something that I do in a usual kind of, right, got to get to the shops, hurry up, you know, it actually became something much more interesting.
Brilliant.
So yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks. It's lovely to hear, when that interest just sort of goes, and it does change your perception, like you say, just that there's sort of red bursting into life everywhere. There's the different sort of, then there's more awareness in the mind, or different sort of, and its friends. Sati has lots of friends that come play well together, and then things, perception changes. We do see things in a different way. Lovely. Okay, so I think we'll maybe pause here and just have a bit of time for a leg stretch. If you want to get a cup of tea, let your mind relax. And maybe just see if there's any, if there's a sort of reflective quality in it, then that's lovely. You might just want to reflect through being aware, but let the mind be really relaxed. And we'll come back at 22:06 and just have a shortish sit before the end of the session. Okay, before the end of the session. And like yesterday, I'll just leave you to sit on if you'd like to. But just to mention, this evening, we're going to have Dharmavasta is going to lead a Ryokan puja that she compiled from Ryokan's poems, which she'll tell us about this evening. And tomorrow there'll be less input. We'll have more of a practice day tomorrow. I'll probably lead a meditation or two. We'll have some readings, but be quite simple, and then there'll be some more input the following day.